Buenos días, Ritu, Bhandari. Ahora estamos comenzando el segundo día de nuestro Smart Cities and Digitality Forum, por una cuestión de que nuestro invitado hoy habla en inglés. Yo voy a switchar a inglés también, así que welcome Ritu Bhandari from the Economist Impact to the Smart Cities and Digitality Forum. It's a pleasure to have you here. For those who are just joining today, the theme is Digital ID. And this first keynote, we expect to be a relevant trigger for the discussions and panels that follows. Ritu Bhandari will introduce the Economist Digital ID Index, and probably this is the first question. What is the Digital ID Index, and what's the relationship to our Latam region? How we scored here, and in particular in digital identification. So, Ritu, please go ahead and let's start with the keynote presentation. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here today, joining you and talking about the Digital Cities Index and some of our very important findings, especially around digital ID. So let me just start by giving a brief overview of the index. This is the Digital Cities Index, like you said. What we have here is the objective of the index. So the key objective of the index is to assess the extent and impact of digitalization in 30 global cities. Because, you know, digitalization of cities can really make them more efficient, more inclusive, and more safer. And how we do this really is by looking at 4 pillars. So on the slide, you see there are 4 key pillars in this index. They are connectivity, services, culture, and sustainability. And I will talk a little bit more about them in a minute. Before that, I want to talk briefly about the methodology. How we put together this index is through 3 main ways. First, we conduct a rigorous literature review. So we study different articles, research papers, evidence on this topic. Second, we speak to experts in this area of smart cities, digital cities. And third, we also conducted a first-hand survey of 3,000 residents in these 30 global cities. Finally, the outputs of this index are a white paper, a data workbook. We also have like short videos and infographics and everything's on our website. But moving on to a little bit about the methodology, like I said earlier, we have 4 key pillars. I'll keep mentioning them again and again. They comprise of 17 indicators, which further include 48 sub-indicators, which are like the data points that ultimately go into deciding a score for a city in the index. And we really use some very credible sources to collect all of this data. Data collection is a very important part of, so this index is created from scratch. And we collect all the data ourselves once we know which indicators are going to be like the main in the main framework of the index. We use government websites, multilaterals, our own data. We do rigorous reviews, and all these indicators have different weights in the index as well. Next, I want to talk a little bit about the 4 pillars because they form the key to how a city scores in this index. Starting with connectivity, this is like, this looks at provision of accessible, affordable, and good quality infrastructure to enable digital connection. So this is really about the infrastructure that exists in a city. The second pillar is around services, which looks at provision of both public and private sector services in different areas like education, healthcare, finance, transport, and retail. And I want to point out here that this is also the pillar that includes the area of digital ID, because it comes under public services, and we look at digital IDs across these 30 cities, and I'll talk about some of those findings in our discussion later. The third pillar is culture. This looks at innovation ecosystem and how our cities incorporating technology into everyday lives of their residents, of their citizens. by creating an enabling environment and an innovation ecosystem that is safe and where, citizens, businesses are able to participate very actively and very safely. And finally, the fourth pillar is around sustainability. Again, sustainability is more and more a very important goal of all cities in the world as they decarbonize, as they set their, decarbonization goals, net neutrality goals. So we also look at a wide range of technologies and how cities are deploying them to become more sustainable and to decarbonize themselves. So these are our four pillars. What you see on the slide is like a smart chart with these four pillars in those red boxes. And within each of those pillars, these are the 17 sub-indicators I was talking about. And these sub-indicators further have a lot of different data points within them. So all of them go into forming a score, a single score for a city, and that's how we score and rank them. This is the scope, geographical scope of the index, just for our viewers to kind of have a sense of, which cities exactly do we cover. We cover a lot of metropolitan cities in the index from different continents across the world. We have 3 cities here from Latin America. However, I do want to highlight that in our white paper and in our research, when we look for best practices and when we go deeper into some of these topics, we do look at cities outside of what we have here as well. So I might kind of talk about some other cities as well as we sail through our conversation. But this was a little bit about the index. I will just pause here and happy to share more as our conversation progresses, but I'll just pause here and pass it back to you.
Focusing now in Latin America region, what are the key findings? What are the elements that are key to digital ID and digital services in general?
Sure. So out of the 4 pillars that I mentioned earlier, cities in Latin America perform particularly well in the culture indicator. And one specific indicator that I want to highlight here that's driving this good performance is the residents' comfort in using digital tools and technologies in Latin American cities. So, the cities perform really well on this indicator. And we assess this indicator through a first-hand survey of citizens across all the cities in the index. And what we see in some of the emerging economies like Latin America and even Asia is that citizens' comfort in using online technologies, tools is relatively higher. And one reason for this could be that these cities and emerging economies are often digital hotspots. They're full of young people who are digital savvy and who are very comfortable with all sorts of digital interactions, and that could be driving this performance. Coming to your question specifically on digital ID, what we find in our research is that it plays a very crucial role in improving the efficiency and delivery of services in a city. So it's really, really crucial, becoming increasingly crucial as highlighted by the pandemic, during the pandemic, when the importance of, online government services, particularly digital identification systems, really increased. And those cities that had a solid digital ID systems were able to serve their citizens in a much more smoother and efficient way. And in Latin America, as well as globally, what we saw that countries rapidly sometimes moved to adopt digital ID so that they could support their citizens, whether it's in verifying vaccination certificates or to share subsidies with them or to support them financially, because a lot of people were vulnerable during the pandemic. To give an example, in Sao Paulo, we saw that, the Sao Paulo state introduced a digital ID program in the middle of the pandemic to help their citizens access public services securely from their homes. And it saw a very large intake, this program saw a very large intake as well. So these are some of the brief key highlights around overall trends in the region, particularly focusing on digital ID as well.
Okay. You mentioned the pandemic's work as an accelerator, and can you give us more details on how it worked? What are the type of services that were developed during the pandemics, and how these made these digital ID programs and solutions come up to, for the public?
Sure. So like I said, starting from healthcare, where governments used the digital ID to kind of target vaccination, mass vaccination at scale in a lot of cities, also to verify vaccination status of a lot of people. So that was one aspect. Another aspect was to use digital ID to really deliver kind of support, like I said earlier, financial support or other forms of support to people of different cities. However, I also want to highlight that while the pandemic really accelerated digital transformation or the importance of digital ID in a lot of cities globally, we need to also, what we also find is that the pandemic very clearly highlighted the existing digital divides in Latin America as well. So, people who had digital IDs or who had access to digital tools and technologies were able to kind of benefit from these services during the pandemic, whereas people who did not, and some of the most vulnerable people did not, they don't even have identities, leave aside digital identities, they don't even have the traditional identities. So they end up suffering a lot more. So that's why the point of inclusion kind of becomes really important, and the pandemic highlighted that. And in Latin America, especially, studies from 2020 highlight that 3 in 10 people still don't have access to the internet, and a large proportion of the population is still unbanked. So that really came up during the pandemic, and students in large proportions could not access online education. They were affected by school closures. And, one of the first next steps for governments as they emerge out of the pandemic is to kind of roll out these foundational digital identification systems, and most importantly, roll them out for everyone in their cities, so that no one's left behind.
All right. So you mentioned that there are programs related to vaccination, access to finance services, and generally I can embrace this into the concept of avoiding the poverty penalty, right? But there are some trends and practices in use and adoption here in digital ID. How do we compare, Latam region to other regions in terms of adoption methodologies, level of, the level of solving these problems and challenges?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. And like I said, in the index, we cover 30 global cities. And like Latin America, we saw a lot of, challenges around, like you highlighted, the poverty penalty that a lot of people experience in other cities as well. And I want to bring in the example of New Delhi here, because Delhi does really well in the digital ID indicator in the index. And this is, this reflects the success of Aadhaar, which is India's national, groundbreaking national identity scheme. And it's enrolled 1.3 billion people since 2009. So it's managed to be very successful in terms of its reach. And what it's done is it's really streamlined delivery of services and payments in New Delhi as well as India. It's boosted financial inclusion, again, what we were talking about, leaving no one behind, and also generally raised, a participation of people from diverse backgrounds in digital economy by really making them a part of this digital identity system. And especially during the pandemic, when millions of migrant workers in India were forced, to stay in lockdown and to return to their villages, it was the biometric ID system that really came to rescue, to support them financially, because they had access to this. It could be done in a very fast, effective manner. However, it is an important caveat here that I brought in my previous kind of response as well, that while this digital system, ID system in India as well, which is really cited as very successful, covers almost the majority of the country, it still leaves behind a fraction of India's population. And while it's just a fraction, it's still millions of people considering India's population. And these are often people who are poor, illiterate, they lack electricity, they lack Wi-Fi network. And that is why it is very, very important that governments ensure that everyone's included in this digital identity systems. Another example is Singapore, which is also a top performer, and the city-state launched its digital ID called SingPass in 2003, and has adapted and evolved the ID system quite a lot to match the changing needs of their citizens. They've also, passed it through a very, very kind of solid Personal Data Protection Act. And now they've shifted it from a browser system to a mobile ID system, because that's how people's habits have changed. We no longer want to use browsers. We are always using our phones. So they've made that shift as well. And another kind of reason for its success, I would say, is that it's very integrated. So, people can access government services as well as private sector business services on the cloud using this. And a final point on this is that the Singapore government also became one of the first to use facial verification in its digital identity scheme. However, which is like a breakthrough, but also it becomes extremely important here. And I'm sure we'll talk about this in some of our discussion later. It becomes extremely important to ensure privacy, security, and transparency of citizens, because some of these technologies can touch on many of the civil liberties of citizens. So yeah, these are some of the best practices that we are seeing from across the world.
Okay, so you mentioned privacy and security, and then are best practices related to these factors? What are the recommendation, or what are the practices that the cities or governments can adopt to mitigate or to handle these important aspects of the digital identification solution systems?
Sure. First is to enable a strong data protection regulation that ensures, for example, that data that is collected for one purpose, for example, from digital ID, is not used for other purposes. So having very clear, comprehensive guideline on what should, the data, citizens' data, personal data be used for is very, very important. And building inclusive and trusted digital ID systems, for example, requires proactive measures to protect people's data by design and by default. So not wait for something to happen, but create those systems while you're designing these digital ID systems. And in the index, we have indicators that specifically assess data protection and privacy regulations in cities, because that's again a very, very important key element. And in Latin America specifically, what we see is that while many countries do have a data protection law, sometimes they lack clarity. So there is a law, there is a policy, which is a great step, but they lack the clear regulations that should kind of be there. For example, sometimes policies might allow collection of a lot of unrelated data of individuals that's not needed. So having clear guidelines on prohibiting that is important. Second point would be to ensure that these systems are strong technologically. So apart from policy, the technologically or the infrastructure is also very important. So without a robust, adequate, and secure technological design that ensures the system's ability to secure data, digital identity should not be implemented. And just to give you an example, some of the health and financial data that could be collected using these systems is very, very sensitive, and their misuse or leakage can lead to exclusion as well as discrimination, and that is why this point is very important. And for example, exposure of a disease status or an economic vulnerability of a person could sometimes mean being denied credit or facing higher health insurance rates. So it's extremely important to kind of ensure that this does not happen. And lastly, what we see in the index is openness. So while it's important to protect data and hide it, but it's also important to promote openness. So really finding that balance, because what we see in top performing cities is that along with protecting privacy, cities can really benefit from open technology that fosters a culture of innovation. So especially with respect to digital IDs, what this could mean is adopting and implementing open source digital ID platforms, which are like public goods, which can have a core infrastructure that can be used by different countries, but which are also flexible as different countries will have very different needs. And there are examples of this emerging already across the world. But yeah, those would be my 3 key best practices picked from our index.
Okay, and you mentioned that there are open source solutions out there. Do you have any example of good implementation of a digital ID or platform related to, well, the adoption of open platforms?
Sure. The one that comes to mind is the modular open source identity platform. It's kind of inspired from India's Aadhaar, and it's a collaboration with a lot of multilaterals, and a lot of governments across the world and Latin America as well are working with this system to adopt it and kind of use it as a foundational ID. This primarily relies on open source and allows its protocols to be seen, developed, and kind of strengthened by all these collective stakeholders who are participating. So yeah, that's one example that comes to my mind.
Right. Okay. So and now looking forward to the future, what is the most important or driver or key elements of the digital ID for the future?
Sure. First would be trust. So, citizens' trust or users' trust. And we interviewed several experts while creating the Digital Cities Index. And one theme or one important issue that came up again and again was highlighted by all of them was citizens' trust. And that's already happening, actually. So a lot of cities are now becoming much more deliberate about engagement, around identifying problems that technology could be used for or could lead to, and involving citizens in designing solutions, being transparent with them about the benefits of these solutions and how their data is being protected is very, very important. So that's the first one. Second is inclusion, which I've highlighted again and again, which would be one of my key takeaways for anyone who's watching this session, that making sure that no one is left behind. And this is very important in Latin America, because despite the intention of digital ID systems to promote inclusion, these systems can risk excluding some of the most marginalized people who need these systems the most, actually. And then they can lose their primary purpose. And one way could be to introduce these systems more gradually and build on some of the pre-existing platforms, and kind of roll them out gradually once everyone's included and made a part of these systems. And if it's ensured that these digital identification systems are safe, and people can trust them, then people will willingly, voluntarily, more and more people will automatically join and would want to use them. And my final point that I've not touched on so far in this conversation is around innovation and the adoption, deployment of emerging technologies like blockchain that could play an important role in ensuring safety of information and digital ID systems, which we talked about, which is like a key issue in this area. And one of the examples that we see in our research is South Korea, which has announced that it will rely on blockchain to create a decentralized digital ID system, which would enable them to create a very secure and safe environment, and where not even the government will have access to individual data, because that's how blockchain, it's a decentralized technology, and it'll reduce the chance of theft, as there's no central server storing all of that information. So those would be three important kind of areas to look out for when it comes to digital ID, in my opinion.
So Ritu, you mentioned a number of challenges, including privacy, and also the inclusion of the whole population. But what about design practices? What about design key elements of an ID system? What do you have from that side, from digital indexes?
Thank you, Daniel. That's a great question. So you're absolutely right. In addition to ensuring inclusion and ensuring protection of data and privacy of users of digital ID, design itself is very, very important. And in the Digital Cities Index, what we see in the top performing cities in this indicator is that they manage to design digital ID systems that are very easy to use and very intuitive. And often, digital ID systems that have a low uptake have a limited functionality, so they don't have options to use a lot of diverse different services. They also have a poor user experience. They're not very user friendly. And sometimes one issue in a lot of at the country level especially, is coordinating across different stakeholders, or for example, municipal governments, because there are separate identification systems that exist in some countries, which are run by separate government agencies in the country. And this is true specifically for Latin America as well, where some countries in the region have many different identity documents instead of a single national identity system. And each state, for example, sometimes in a country issues its own model of identification document, and a single person can have many different types of identities based on different locations. So yeah, it's really important for governments to not just adopt a digital ID system that another country has, but really tailor its design to suit their systems and to suit their citizens and residents. That's definitely very, very important.
Okay, Ritu, thank you very much. I think that we are closing this session now. I don't know if any final word or to the panel that is coming next.
Yeah, no, absolutely, Daniel. It was a pleasure to be here and to talk about this very, very important and timely topic. And I would just say what I've already said, that digital ID is going to play a more and more critical role, for cities to deliver services to their citizens and make their cities efficient and more livable. And hope some of these conversations will kind of get us in the right direction. And again, it was a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.